All right, back to the conversations here at hand. I'm just watching the update. The jet in India, again, looks grim. Airline has crashed their flight AI-171 on its way to Gatwick. Did not make it. Joining me now is Brent Sadler, Senior Research Fellow at the Naval Warfare and Advanced Technology Allison Center for National Security. Rebuilding America's maritime muscle with the Ships for America Act. This is a big deal. Brent, welcome to the program.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Glad to have you. Now, if I followed the numbers correctly, and help me if I'm off a little bit, but my understanding is China built something like 1,500 ships last year, and we built 6. It's something like that, 1,500 to 6. Does that sound about right?
That's about right.
Unbelievable. Right. How do we compete with China, who has a blue water navy for the first time, is putting out aircraft carriers for the first time, clearly is on a war footing, and is it, well, whether we realize it or not, we're at war with China, pretty obviously. We saw right here in Michigan these Chinese students being apprehended with agricultural agents that could destroy our corn, wheat, rice, barley, all of it, right?
Yeah. It's a known threat. The Chinese, this China threat hasn't just materialized in the last couple of years. It's been developing since 1998, when they made it clear they were going to dominate the maritime industrial sector. And they did it 8 years later. So we've been admiring this problem because it's too expensive and too inconvenient to really address. Shipbuilding is capital intensive, labor intensive, technologically intensive. And so we've allowed it to neglect, both in the commercial shipbuilding and most dangerously our naval shipbuilding. And so we are where we are. Not because of the misdecisions or bad management of the last few years, but really a decade plus of just apathy. And now we're dealing with a problem that we're not going to be able to resolve with one budget cycle.
No, you can't resolve this with one budget cycle. Are we heading in the right direction, though, the Ships Act? Do you think that's a step in the right direction, Brent?
It is not a perfect solution, but we can't let that be the enemy of good enough to get started. It's the first time since Nixon was in office that many people that remember those, much older than me, recall the national effort to revive the maritime industry back then. And this is actually even much more substantive and much more expansive and comprehensive, not because it's nice to do or politically favorable right now, but it's necessary.
It's interesting, reflecting on my time reading about such things. Every few years, it seems, America has to do this, all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt, who had to reinvigorate the United States Navy when he was president. And then a few years later, when Woodrow Wilson was president, and then FDR, and so on and so forth. It seems to me, Republican or Democrat, every so often, the Navy gets forgotten about. Oh, they're fine over there. We don't pay attention to them. They're good. And every few years, until now, here we are doing it again. We have to come back and say, wait a second, we're not ready for what we might face. Just keeps happening.
Yes, as they say, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And the dangers, it feels very similar to what the nation was going through in the mid-30s in the lead up to World War II. We knew that Hitler was building a war machine to contest the democracy of the world with the intent of going to war. But many of the democracies at the time, the United States, Britain, France, kind of let things go far too long. And then for the United States situation, we created what was called a Naval Act to invigorate, get the demand signal to try to grow the capacity. It was a little too late, but it was at least good enough so that after Pearl Harbor attack, we at least had the structure, the foundation to build on rapidly. We're far from that point right now.
So I actually see that it's 1,800 ships that China built. I see this in a little bit of quick research here. So here's the thing. How many ships do we need? How outdated is our Navy? How can we compete if we're that far behind?
Yeah, it's a complicated issue because shipbuilding takes years. Supply base takes 2 to 3 years to expand. The fleet that we have is really an echo of the Cold War fleet that we had. And ships last anywhere from 20 to 30, and if they're aircraft carriers, up to 45 to 50 years in age. And our fleet is aging out rapidly. It's already aging out faster than our shipyards can replace them. Because, again, we have allowed our nation to get into this situation. So that's one. We've got to build more ships at max capacity at the yards, which means we're going to have to train new workers, which is going to take time to grow the workforce. But the other problem is we don't have enough shipyards to do the maintenance, nor do the type of building that we need. So we're going to have to do capital intensive investments, 5 to 7 years to build the fleet or build the shipyards and the infrastructure to build the fleet that we need. The number 355 has been thrown around, 381. In my book from 2023, I kind of went through the math, the threat-based kind of perspective on it, and the number's a lot higher. And if you talk to naval leadership, they'll even admit that the number of 381 is really not quite going to get to where we need to be. The problem is no one's talking about the need to have ships in the water this decade where the threat from China is the highest. So we got to do some creative things like using unmanned ships in the interim, because we can get those to the sea a lot quicker. So
well,
we got to break the old paradigms.
I think the world changed, Brent, when
Yes.
Ukraine launched that drone attack deep into Russian territory. I think the face of warfare changed, and maybe big ships are big targets for massive amounts of drones. Maybe it's time to rethink how we're doing things. However, I do want to ask you about one thing here that you wrote. The Ships for America Act is a promising step, but unless Congress adds structural tax reform, a grant-backed capacity model, and rethinks protectionist liabilities, the legislation will struggle to deliver the maritime resurgence America urgently needs. What structural tax reform, what protectionist liabilities?
So we do need to, I'd also add, we have to look at regulatory reform because we want to create a favorable environment for new industrial activity. We've got to do it smartly. We've got to do it in a way that we don't damage the environment or the people's livelihoods around it, but we have to find a way that we prioritize regaining maritime industrial might. So there has to be regulatory relief, things in like maritime prosperity zones, so geographically constrained type of reliefs. Looking at restructuring the way that we tax profits in these companies. Right now, Wall Street is prioritized, and our shipbuilders are publicly traded industries. They're prioritized to answer not to the nation or to the Navy, but to their stockholders or to their board. And so changing the profit calculations to one of reinvestment in the capital is one thing to do. And one way of doing that is doing a proportion of the profits being taxed that only go back to the shareholders. In other words, if you invest in capital and workforce, you get tax-free profit margins. And again, that's what's needed to prioritize growth of the capital and the infrastructure.
Yeah, there you go. Brent Sadler, Senior Research Fellow of the Naval Warfare and Advanced Technology at the Allison Center for National Security. Greatly appreciate you being here, Brent. Come back anytime because this is an ongoing conversation, and we need to get started now. And I appreciate you taking the time to be here.
Absolutely. Have a good day.
There you go. Yeah, can you imagine 1,800 ships the Chinese built? We built 6. Not exactly going to compete with those folks if we have 6 and they have 1,800. We need 500 new ships. How do they do it? How do they do it? Remarkable. All right, we'll take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about protecting your money. Protecting your money. After the break, right here on the Steve Gruber Show.